My maid of honor's hand flew to her mouth before she even reached me, and that was how I knew the makeup hadn't worked. The concealer my best friend had layered on that morning in the bridal suite, the color-correcting stuff she'd run out to the Shoppers Drug Mart on Yonge to buy at 6 a.m. None of it had held under the chandelier light. The bruise had bloomed straight through it, deep plum, going green at the edge of my cheekbone. The eye above it swollen so the lash line sat half-closed, no matter how wide I tried to open it. I heard the whispers start before I'd even cleared the doorway. Not about the dress. Not about the December snow coming down soft and pretty against the tall windows of the estate. About my face. And the man I was about to marry. I watched him see it. I watched him see me, and then I watched him find my mother in the second row, and something in his jaw eased. His mouth went up at one corner. Not nerves. Not regret. Satisfaction, plain as anything. The look of a man checking a box. He leaned toward the cousin sitting nearest him and said, "Not nearly quiet enough. Should have watched that last glass of wine, hey?" And the people around him laughed. They laughed. On the day I was supposed to marry him, in a room full of camel coats and good watches, people I'd shaken hands with at dinner parties tipped their heads back and laughed at my broken face. It took me a long time afterward to understand why they laughed, and I'm going to tell you, because it's the part everyone gets stuck on. They laughed because they didn't know. The night before, at the rehearsal supper, he told the whole table a little story. How I'd had one too many flutes of Prosecco celebrating. How I'd missed the bottom step on the icy walk out to the car and gone down hard. How clumsy his bride was. Wasn't it adorable? He told it warmly. He told it like a man fond of his fiancé's small disasters. So when I walked in the next morning wrecked, they thought they were in on a joke. The drunk bride and the patient groom. That's what a story does. It decides for people what their own eyes are seeing. My name is Camille Tremblay. I'm 31. I grew up in Ottawa and live in Toronto, and at the time I was a senior manager in corporate finance at a firm downtown, which matters, and I'll get to why. That morning, I was supposed to walk out of that hall as somebody's wife. Instead, I walked out as the woman who took the whole thing apart in front of 200 guests, and I would do it again tomorrow. But standing there at the back of the room, bouquet sweating in my hands, I needed them all to keep believing the obedient version of me. So I let them. I didn't always look like a cautionary tale in white. 3 years before, he was the most put-together man I'd ever met. Old Toronto family, the kind with a name on a hospital wing in a cottage in Muskoka. That had been in the family since before the highway went in. He worked at his father's firm on Bay Street, wealth management, private placements. The sort of thing that sounds dull until you see the size of the numbers. He wore his money quietly, which is the most expensive way to wear it. He wrote actual letters by hand on heavy cream paper. He pulled out chairs. He called my mother "ma'am" the first time, and she nearly floated out of the restaurant. She adored him before I did. That's the truth I had to sit with later. My mother raised me alone after my dad left when I was 9. And she'd spent 20 years convinced that the great mistake of her life was that she'd been too much, too loud, too independent, too quick to have an opinion at the dinner table, and that it had cost her a husband. So when a steady, well-spoken man with money and manners looked at her difficult daughter and said, "I'll take care of her," my mother heard salvation. Not for me, for the version of herself she still grieved. "He's solid," she'd say. "He's a man who leads, Camille. You've never had that." The first crack came about 6 months in. I got a promotion. A real one, my name on the door of a project that mattered. A raise that meant I could finally max out my RRSP without sweating it. I came home glowing and he went cold. Not angry. Cold. He said the hours would make me unavailable. He said it in a disappointed voice, like I'd let us both down. When I laughed and said I'd figure out the hours, the laugh died in the air between us, and he didn't speak to me for 3 days. 3 full days of being in the same condo and treated like furniture. By the end of it, I was apologizing for something I couldn't name, just to make the cold stop. Then it was the clothes. That dress is asking for attention. Then it was my voice. You don't need to be the loudest one in the meeting. Then it was my friends. She's a bad influence. She's bitter because she's single. I just don't like how you are around her. One at a time, never all at once. Each one small enough that fighting it would have made me the unreasonable one. And every time I went to my mother, hoping she'd be the one to say that's not normal, she tilted her head and said the same thing in different words. He just wants what's best for you. Men like him don't come along twice, Camille. Don't throw away the best thing that's ever wanted you. So by year 2, I'd sanded myself down, quieter in meetings, lower heels, fewer dinners with the people who'd known me before him. I told myself it was compromise. That's what they call it, the smart ones, when they take you apart. Compromise. Growth. Becoming a we. The night before the wedding is where it stopped being something I could explain away. We were at the estate. The family had taken the whole place. A restored Edwardian hall an hour north of the city. The kind with a coach house and a frozen pond and staff who called you by name. After the rehearsal supper, after he told the Prosecco story and everyone had laughed and gone up to their rooms, he asked me to come to the study to go over the morning. On the desk was the folder. Inside was the marriage contract. We'd signed a version of it weeks earlier, both of us with our own lawyers, the way you're supposed to in Ontario for the thing to even hold up. I'd read that one carefully, it was clean. This was a new version. He'd had pages slipped in, an amendment that rolled my assets, my savings, the equity in the condo I'd bought before I ever met him, into a joint holding company. A numbered company. One I'd never heard of, registered in Ontario, with his father listed as a director. It's just tidier this way, he said. One household, one structure. My father's accountants handle everything. You don't have to think about it. I said, no. I said it the way you say no when you've spent 2 years forgetting how. It came out shaky, but it came out. I said I wasn't signing anything that moved my own money into a company I couldn't see inside of, and that we could do all of this properly after the wedding with both lawyers in the room. His face did something I'd never let myself fully look at before. The charm just left, like a light switched off behind glass. He stepped close. I remember the cold smell of his cologne, something with cedar in it that I have never since been able to stand in another person. He said my name very softly, and then there's a gap. There's a white space where the rest of that sentence should be. When I came back to myself, I was on the floor of the study with my cheek against the cold and the side of my face screaming, and he was sitting in the leather chair by the fire with his sleeves rolled up, watching me the way you watch a kettle to see if it's going to boil over. Calm, curious, almost. Like he was waiting to find out whether I'd finally understood the assignment. You slipped, he said. You'd had too much. You came in here upset and you went down on the corner of the desk. That's the story, and it's a kind story, Camille, because the true story is that you embarrassed yourself. I touched my face and the pain told me everything his voice was lying about. My phone buzzed on the desk, my best friend's name on the screen. She'd texted twice already that night, the way she'd been texting more and more all year, checking. He picked it up before I could move. He didn't unlock it. He just held it to his ear when it rang through to voicemail, and in the warmest voice you've ever heard, he said, "She's fine. She's just exhausted. Big day tomorrow. She'll call you after the honeymoon." And he hung up, and he set the phone back down. Screen turned away from me, and he said, "Get some sleep. You'll want to look your best." My mother arrived at the estate at 7 the next morning. The staff had moved me to the bridal suite by then, and my friend was already there, white-faced, because the voicemail hadn't sounded right to her and she'd driven up at dawn through the snow. When my mother came in and saw my face, she didn't gasp. I want you to really hear that. My own mother looked at her daughter's swollen, broken eye, and she crossed the room and she took my chin in her hand and turned my face toward the window like she was checking the work. Then she let go and she said, "Well, you'll remember this one. A marriage is built on respect, Camille, and now you'll respect it." That was the exact moment something in me stopped breaking and started counting. Because here's what nobody in that hall knew. What he didn't know, what my mother didn't know, what the 200 guests pulling on their good coats didn't know. My best friend had put a security app on my phone 8 months earlier. She'd done it half as a joke and half not. One night at her kitchen table after I'd told her, laughing in a way that wasn't a real laugh, about the 3 days of silence over my promotion. It backs up to the cloud, she'd said. Audio, screen, the works. Just in case you ever need to prove to yourself you're not crazy. I'd let her, because letting her felt easier than arguing, and then I'd forgotten about it. It had been running quietly in my pocket for 8 months, including in the study, including the night before. And here's the other thing. I'm good with numbers. It is literally my job. For 2 years, he'd been telling me I was too emotional to understand the family's finances, too soft, that I should leave the money to the men. And for 2 years, I'd been doing, very quietly, the only thing I've ever been genuinely excellent at. I'd been reading the folder he kept leaving on the desk, the numbered company, the names of the directors. I'd pulled the corporate filings, which in Ontario anyone can pull. I'd seen the same 3 numbered companies appear and disappear across his father's firm like a shell game. And about 4 months before the wedding, with my own money, I'd quietly hired a forensic accountant, a woman who used to work for the regulator, and I'd handed her everything. So when my mother turned my face to the window and told me to be grateful for the lesson, I wasn't standing there shattered. I was standing there with a loaded gun in my purse, and they'd just handed me a reason to fire it in public. The hall was full by 11. 200 chairs, white lilies flown in from somewhere, the string quartet doing something soft by the windows, snow coming down outside like the whole thing was being filmed for a brochure. His father sat in the 3rd row in a charcoal suit that cost more than my car. Bay Street people, 2 members of his firm's board, the kind of room where everyone knows everyone's net worth to the decimal. I walked the aisle. I'll be honest, my legs did it without me. He squeezed my hand at the front, and it wasn't tender, it was a grip, a reminder, behave. My mother sat in the front row with her chin up, watching to make sure her difficult daughter performed the part correctly for once in her life. When the officiant asked if anyone present knew of a reason these two should not be joined, the room did its little polite chuckle, the way rooms do at that line, and my fiancé, riding the warmth of it, leaned in and brushed his thumb along the top of my bruised cheek, gentle, for the audience, and murmured, just loud enough for the front rows, "She'll think twice next time." And he smiled at my mother. And a few of them laughed again, soft, indulgent. The clumsy bride and her patient man. That was the moment they were all waiting for me to do the obedient thing. Lower my eyes. Blush, forgive. I let go of his hand and I reached for the small podium microphone the officiant had been using. The quartet stumbled and stopped. 200 faces turned. "Before we go on," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect, given the way my jaw still ached. "There's something I think everyone should see." His fingers closed around my wrist. Too late. I'd already nodded to my best friend at the back, who was standing beside the AV technician the venue provided, the same screen they'd been planning to run the slideshow of our engagement photos on during the reception. The big screen behind the head table flickered, and the whole room went dead silent. The image froze on a single frame. Him. The study. Sleeves rolled, firelight. That calm and curious face. "My phone backs everything up," I said into the mic. Audio. Recorded automatically. I didn't set it up that way for a moment like this, but I'm grateful this morning that it was running. I pressed play. His voice filled the hall first. "You'd had too much. You went down on the corner of the desk." That's the story, and it's a kind story. Then the audio from earlier in the night, the part before the gap in my own memory. My voice saying no, his saying my name, soft and cold. And then a sound. A short, flat, sickening crack and a thud. And then nothing. I didn't flinch. I'd heard it a dozen times, sitting alone in the bathroom of the bridal suite that morning, learning to keep my face still through it. I paused it before anything more. I didn't need more. I did fall, I said to the room. That part's true, just not the way he told you at dinner last night. He was on his feet. Turn that off. All the charm was gone now in front of everyone and they could all hear it. Turn it off, Camille. I tilted my head so the bruise caught the light. No. My mother half rose from the front row, her face the color of the lilies. Camille. Stop this. Not here. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up the second envelope from inside the podium, where I'd tucked it that morning, and that was when the room stopped being on his side. I didn't even open it dramatically. I just held it up so they could see the letterhead through the thin paper, and I turned back to the guests, to the board members, to his father, to the people whose money was tangled up with his. For 2 years, I said, I believed I was the problem. Too emotional, too ambitious, too difficult to manage. I let a lot of people in this room watch me get quieter, and I let them tell each other it was love. I slid the pages out. It wasn't. So while he was busy correcting my posture and my tone, I went and did the one thing I actually happened to be very good at. I read. I held the top page higher. 3 weeks ago, I was asked to sign an amendment to our marriage contract. An amendment that would have moved everything I own into a numbered company controlled by his father. My condo. My savings. My pension. Into a structure I wasn't allowed to look inside of. A murmur went through the chairs. I saw 2 of the board members glance at each other. So I looked inside of it anyway, I said. I hired a forensic accountant, a good one. And what we found is that this firm, I let the name on the letterhead sit there a second, has been moving client money through a chain of numbered companies to paper over losses that should have been disclosed years ago. There's undisclosed debt. There are positions that don't exist where the statements say they do. And there is a very large hole that someone needed fresh, clean money to fill. I looked right at him. You needed my clean financials, I said. You needed a wife with no flags and a paid-off condo, so the bank would keep the line of credit open 1 more quarter. This wedding was never about respect. It was a deposit. He lunged for the pages. He didn't get there because the venue's security, the ones my wedding planner had hired for crowd flow, the great irony of the whole day, stepped between us before he'd taken 2 steps. I'd had a quiet word with the planner that morning, too. I think she'd half-guessed. Women often half-guess and then talk themselves out of it the way I did for 2 years. I stepped back from him, calm, and I delivered the last part to the room. I've already given everything to the Ontario Securities Commission, I said, and to the RCMP as of this morning. Every file? So no, this isn't a scene. This is the last morning any of you get to pretend you didn't see it. His father stood up so fast his chair scraped. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his son with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not shock, recognition. The look of a man whose worst private fear has just walked into the room wearing a wedding dress. Is it true? His father said. Just that. My son-to-be opened his mouth, and nothing came out, because the only answer was the one he couldn't say in front of his board. He spun back to the room to the guests, and he did the thing they always do at the end. She's unstable, he said, loud, fast. Look at her. She's hysterical. None of this is. She's not well. The word hung there. Hysterical. The oldest one in the book. I let it hang for a second. Then I said, quietly, into the microphone so it carried to every corner of that beautiful hall, I'm not hysterical. I'm informed. There's a difference, and your board is about to learn it. I set the mic down on the podium. I stepped off the dais, and my heels were loud on the marble in a room that had no other sound left in it. My mother caught my arm as I passed the front row. Her grip was weak now. Her lipstick smile was gone for good. You've ruined yourself, she whispered. Do you understand what you've done? No one will. You'll have nothing. I stopped. I looked at her, and for the first time in my whole life, I didn't see the woman I'd spent 31 years trying to make proud. I saw a frightened person who'd been so badly taught what love costs that she'd been willing to spend her own daughter to buy it. My whole life was supposed to have something in it besides being managed, I said. I just took it back. And I walked out of the hall and into the snow, in a wedding dress, and my best friend was already there at the curb with the car running and the heat on, because she'd never once stopped believing me, not even on the nights I'd stopped believing myself. "You okay?" she asked. I touched the bruise under my eye. "It'll fade." What wasn't going to fade was the look on his face when the last piece dropped, which I'll tell you now, because by then, we were on the highway with the city coming up gray and bright ahead of us, and I finally let myself feel it. The recordings were real. The first thing accountant was real. The OSC, the RCMP, every file I'd handed over, all of it real. But the amendment, the one he'd shoved in front of me the night before, the one I'd said no to and gotten a broken face for, I was never going to sign it. I'd decided that months before I ever stepped into that study. The bruise was never a lesson. It was the one piece of evidence I hadn't had yet. The one thing that would turn a financial complaint into something the police couldn't file away in a drawer. He gave it to me himself. He handed it to me in a leather study with a fire going, and he sat back in the chair afterward, satisfied, certain he'd taught me my place. He'd taught me all right. I want to tell you the rest, because I know what you'd want to know. I wanted to know it too, when I used to watch other women's stories and scream at the screen. But did anyone actually pay? Yes, I pressed charges. I drove to the police station 3 days later with the audio and the photos a doctor took at the walk-in clinic, and I gave a statement, and it became a real file with a real number, and it is, as I write this, going through the courts. Assault is a criminal matter in this country, not a private family embarrassment, and I made very sure it stayed that way. My mother is part of why this took me as long as it did to find the words for, so I'll try to be fair to her, because fair is harder than angry, and I'm done with easy. She wasn't evil. She was a woman who'd been left, who decided being left was the worst thing that could happen to a person, and who looked at her daughter's bruise and genuinely believed she was watching me secure my future. That's the part that still keeps me up. Not the malice, the love, pointed exactly backwards. She has not called me. I have not called her. I left her a letter, the kind you write once and don't expect an answer to, telling her that I forgave the small woman she'd been made into, and that I was never going to let her near the life I was building. Some doors you close gently, they're still closed. His firm. I read about it in the Globe like everyone else. 3 months after the wedding that didn't happen, there was a regulatory notice, then a quiet announcement about a restructuring, then a longer article a few weeks later, with words like forbearance and investigation, and his father's careful resignation, for health reasons. My fiancé, the man I was supposed to marry, left the firm too. The polite version said he was pursuing other opportunities. The real version is sitting in a file with a number on it, in a building downtown, waiting its turn. I kept my own money. The condo's still mine. My job's still mine. Better than mine, actually, because it turns out the story of the analyst who read her way out of a financial fraud at her own wedding travels fast in a small industry and not in the direction he'd hoped. My best friend stood up for me at a much smaller, much happier thing. 18 months later, with about 12 people in no-string quartet and no one wearing a watch worth more than the cake. Nobody laughed at me that day either. They laughed because they were happy. I'd forgotten the two could look so different. I kept my name too. Camille Tremblay, not because it's anything special. Because it's mine. And a long time ago I let a man with cedar cologne convince me that handing it over was the same as being loved. I learned the difference in a study with a fire going, on the floor, counting. So if you ever find yourself in a beautiful room full of people who are laughing at something they don't understand, and a man who hurt you is smiling at your mother, Don't cry and don't forgive, and for God's sake, don't sign. Read everything. Keep the recording. And when they're certain you've finally learned to be obedient, that's exactly when you give them consequences instead. For a long time, I thought the smartest thing I ever did was hire that forensic accountant 4 months before the wedding. It wasn't. The smartest thing I did was much smaller and much harder. It was the night I stopped arguing with my own gut and started writing down what was actually happening in plain dates and plain numbers, instead of letting him tell me what my own life meant. Everything that fell on him fell because of choices, not luck. He chose to hit me the night before because he was certain there'd be no consequence, and the certainty itself was the trap, because a man who feels untouchable gets careless, and careless men leave recordings and paper trails. My mother chose to turn my face to the window and call it respect. And that choice is the reason there is now a closed door between us that I did not slam, only locked. Cause and effect doesn't care how charming you are in cream stationery. You build with what you do. What got me out wasn't anger, though I had plenty. It was 3 things I had to grow on purpose, because nobody handed them to me. The first was refusing to lie to myself about right and wrong, even when the lie would have been easier. Knowing that letting a man hurt me quietly didn't make me loyal. It made me complicit in my own erasure. The second was learning to actually use what was in my head instead of apologizing for it. For 2 years, I let him convince me that being good with numbers and good in a meeting was a flaw to manage, when it was the exact thing that would save me. And the third was the plain, unglamorous willingness to keep going on the mornings when going felt impossible, to drive to the police station 3 days later, to give the statement, to read the contract one more time when every part of me wanted to disappear. I won't pretend it was clean. I lost my mother in the way that matters. I stood in snow in a wedding dress and felt the bottom drop out of the future I'd planned. But I kept my name, my money, my work, and the thing I'd nearly handed over for good. The part of me that knew the difference between being loved and being managed. If you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Write down what you see. Trust the part of your mind they keep telling you to quiet. And when they're sure you finally learn to stay small, that's the morning to stand all the way up. Camille Tremblay is still my name. I earned the right to keep it on the floor of a study with a fire going, counting.